Good evening. Welcome to tomorrow's Tropics for 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. Today's the first day of the official Atlantic hurricane season and the first day of June, which means it's time to take another look at the conditions into that are unfolding and what it looks like we'll end up looking at for the peak of the season. So please note, I'm not a meteorologist, and this forecast is just based on my entirely on my own opinion and is not official at all. And for any decision making, please contact your local officials or the National Hurricane Center. Now it's looking like we're in store for another above average season, but the extent of which we're not quite certain of. Let's take a look first at the ENSO phase, and after some uncertainty into that, it's looking like we won't be seeing El Nino set up. Instead, we're looking at a move to ENSO neutral that we're currently in, and possibly warm neutral as these warm anomalies under the surface start to get up to the surface. So we're heading in warm neutral, but it doesn't seem at this point that we'll have El Nino in place for the peak of the season, because with the Eastern Hemisphere monsoon onset starting beginning at this point, that has tended to shut down El Nino development in the past few years, and it doesn't seem that I don't think that will be an exception this year. So if there isn't momentum in favor of that at this point, we're probably not going to end up with El Nino in the peak of the season, or even at all at this point. The atmosphere is generally ENSO neutral now. You have this rising air that's not quite over the Indo-Pacific warm pool, so this isn't quite La Nina-like, but it's not El Nino-like, so it seems to be sort of ENSO neutral. However, there are some residual signals of La Nina, and one of these is the warm Indo-Pacific warm pool relative to average, and this would tend to focus rising air over around here and strengthen the Walker cell and keep an El Nino keep El Nino kind of at bay for at least this year. At the same time, we've got a negative Indian Ocean dipole here that's trying to get going. That's with cooler waters to the west and warmer waters to the east, and you've got a kind of an Atlantic Nino type of signature getting going in the Atlantic. So these signals both favor a negative ENSO, because the former here focuses rising air over the Indo-Pacific warm pool that's consistent with La Nina, and this just sort of focuses rising air and that warm water over in the Atlantic. And when it's focused in the Atlantic and not the Pacific, and when you've also got the negative Indian Ocean dipole, it seems more likely that we're going to kind of get into warm neutral based on the heat on the surface getting to the surface. But after that, the kind of a dip back into cool neutral or La Nina, which hasn't been all that uncommon with La Nina events in the past couple of decades. So it does seem that we'll have sort of cool neutral, and so going into the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season, here's May's official probabilistic and forecast for that, and you can see at the peak of the season, so it's August, September, and October. Try that tri-monthly. See, there's a slight chance in favor of neutral rather than La Nina, but as sort of signal like this suggests a solidly cool neutral look, and with increasing La Nina chances going further out, it does seem that we're headed to that sort of double dip scenario. Let's take a look at the models. They aren't cool leaning as much as the official product, but even these have really no enthusiasm for El Nino. There's like one member that's kind of an outlier here that goes into El Nino, but otherwise it's entirely neutral or La Nina. So it seems at the conclusion of this spring predictability barrier, there's probably not going to be any El Nino. And alongside that, there's also a cool area of water that's what that's associated with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation negative phase. And what that's going to do is it's probably going to hurt the Eastern Pacific basin because of that cooler water causing more stability, more shear, and generally a slate of unfavorable conditions. And without an El Nino or an active Eastern Pacific hurricane season, you have less rising air in the Pacific, and more of that would probably go into the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic, both of which would favor some activity. But at the same time, if you don't have a lot of convection in this area, you don't have as much of that outflow and shear, which would make for unfavorable and high shear conditions in the Atlantic. So it seems that shear will be low, and the Pacific seems very favorable for an active Atlantic hurricane season. But of course, it's not black and white, because if you look at the Atlantic, that actually suggests that things are a bit less favorable. Least at this point, it seems to be the major factor kind of holding it back from, say, an extremely active season. When taking a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies in the actual Atlantic basin, things aren't quite as favorable as I said, because there is that big area of warm water in the subtropics and generally cooler water in the deep tropics. And what that tends to mean is there's instability that occurs more to the north, but not really in the deep tropics. And that tends to decrease activity. And the fact that we're seeing a sort of signal like this means that we're probably not going to probably or suggesting that we might not see one of those kind of big blockbuster extremely active seasons, because although we've seen this sort of pattern a lot reverse and cause an active season, usually those huge seasons tend to have a more first EOF signal of a positive Atlantic multi-decadal escalation, and we're not quite seeing that. So it seems that the very high-end sort of scenarios are kind of getting whittled out, sort of like the possibility for a below-average season. But this isn't probably going to stay around, because there has been one thing that's been warming up the main development region for the past 4 or 5 years now, and that is Africa. And this is another kind of big thing that really suggests a high activity season. And the first part of this is a weaker uh, African Easter or African easterly jet, and that's at 700 millibars, weaker jet than normal. And that might seem kind of counterintuitive, but if you kind of think of the jet as kind of going through here, and you've got that weaker zonal flow than normal, that means you don't need as much of that north-south meridional flow for a kind of kink to form in that jet flow. So that means if you've got a weaker jet here, along with that kind of cyclonic anomaly at that level, that means it's also easier to get kinks in the flow and get tropical waves getting going. And with that anomalously cyclonic flow that is associated with active hurricane seasons, you tend to get a favorable environment that keeps them in generally good shape as they get off into the Atlantic. And at the same time, this area of westerly anomaly also somewhat translates to the surface and causes weak trade winds in this sort of region between Africa and South America, and has warmed up the Atlantic for several years in a row, and in 2018 kind of caused a below average season bust because of the warming there. And it seems that that will occur to some extent this year, and I'm not too sure how much, but it does seem that we'll get an above average main development region given it's near average right now, and that will favor an above average season as well, but maybe not as much as, say, Africa or the Pacific sort of pattern. Now let's look at the precipitable water anomaly over Africa. So it's not quite as wet as it has been recently. The Sahel region is generally wetter than normal still, though, and has been for quite a while. And that will favor again more moist waves, a lot more convection getting kind of off into the Atlantic, and so that means you have more convection and stronger waves, and that tends to or coupled with a favorable environment coming off there, that means there's a good kind of area where you can get tropical cyclones getting going, and where you can kind of get rack up those accumulated cyclone energy points if you can get a kind of long tracked cyclone coming off of the main development region. Something interesting to note also is the below average precipitable water, so drier air to the south. So that suggests that there will be more moisture air, kind of in a dipole fashion here for the Atlantic. And what that means is if you have the moisture air here, that means less Saharan dust coming off that region. And that means less waves kind of getting choked off by that sort of Saharan dust that tends to dry out the atmosphere and kind of hurt tropical cyclogenesis. One thing that would also be suggestive of a weaker African monsoon would be the warm Gulf of Guinea, which is also that Atlantic Nino here. See slightly warmer than average conditions, and what that would do is reduce the temperature gradient between that region and the Sahara Desert, and so that would mean the temperature gradient that actually fuels a monsoon isn't as strong, and that would obviously lead to a weaker monsoon. However, despite that, the general Sahara is quite a bit warmer than normal. So if you have a warmer than normal Sahara anyway, that kind of cancels out the Atlantic Nino that tends to weaken the gradient, and that is why we're probably going to see another strong African monsoon, but maybe not to the extent that we saw last year. One thing that's pretty good to look at as well for a forecast is the model guidance, and that's kind of a good tool on top of other factors that are looked at. And here's a CFS model, which is commonly used for this sort of thing. And looking at the August, September, October tri-monthly, so that is the peak of the hurricane season, you can see generally neutral ENSO here. There's a bit of a warm tongue here, but I'm not so sure I believe that's kind of strange, and the velocity potential anomaly too also suggests something slightly more cool neutral than the actual sea surface temperature anomaly field. But you can see here that negative Indian Ocean dipole and warm Indo-Pacific warm pool, so that does suggest that negative ENSO. You can see that it has looks at it or has a warmer main development region than we have now. It goes from slightly below average to decently above average, and so this is generally favorable Pacific pattern for the Atlantic. You can see the rising air over here, rising air over Africa, and generally no areas of big rising air in the Pacific, because one kind of thing that had kind of hurt the seasons in middle of last decade is you had a big rising branch in the Eastern Pacific here, and that helped the East Pacific hurricane season and tended to shear the Caribbean. And in the last few years, that has kind of gone away, with the exception of 2018. And if that does happen, it's generally a signal for more active than normal Atlantic basin. And consistent with that, it also has a depiction of low shear and a stronger than normal tropical easterly jet. So that suggests favorable deep tropical conditions. So in general, this seems consistent with a very active season. But uh, the CFS in general is not so gung ho. It has a very wet Africa and part of the intertropical convergence zone, but you can see it's actually suppressed. You can see this kind of dipole here between dry and wet, and if you have the wet further south, that means you have a suppressed intertropical convergence zone. You don't even really need to look at that. It's pretty far south for the peak of the season. And generally, elsewhere in the main development region, there isn't a whole lot going on. It's not there isn't a strong wet signal, so it doesn't seem to suggest very heavy deep tropical activity. There are some suggestions of subtropical activity, but not so much as of that deep tropical activity. And it might seem kind of weird at first because despite all those favorable conditions, there should be some sort of thing going on there. But it seems that because of this signal the uh, with the warmer subtropics and also a negative Atlantic meridional mode here, the warm South Atlantic, both of those tend to uh, decrease the instability in the tropical North Atlantic, and the latter of these also suppresses the intertropical convergence zone down to the south. So, in these combined seem to make the model less excited about the season, despite otherwise favorable conditions. Another thing that kind of tips us off to that is this area of lower pressure than normal that is north of the main development region. And if you have that instead of it being right here, that is a sign that there's more instability relative to average further north, and that would suggest less activity in the deep tropics. We'll have to see if this does happen. Sometimes it is a little bit too warm in the subtropics and a little bit not warm enough in the tropics. But we'll have to see. This seems to be the one big thing that's keeping the season from becoming a lot more active, or having, or me having a confident forecast, something like that. Because while the Pacific is very favorable looking, the actual Atlantic basin doesn't seem to be as favorable looking for tropical cyclogenesis in general this season. But we'll definitely have to see. And even putting these together, it does seem that we'll end up getting a solidly above average season. And with this update, I'm forecasting 16 to 20 named storms, 9 to 11 hurricanes, 3 to 5 major hurricanes with an accumulated cyclone energy index of 130 to 170. So that's uh, very, it's quite an active season. But that kind of hinges on the Atlantic and what it does, because there is some uncertainty into that, and there's a decent chance that it could bust low if it's very stable, or if this kind of sorts itself out, we might see the opposite and an extremely active season. But it's kind of hard to make a very high confidence forecast, in my opinion, at this point. But no matter if the season is hyperactive or if it's inactive, it only takes one storm to make it a bad season in your area. And given that the hurricane season now is now here, you should be generally prepared for a hit this season, just in case. And make sure you have supplies for a possible strike before a storm gets there. And well, hopefully stay safe, and hopefully there aren't major land impacts this season. If you have any questions, comments about my video, please let me know. And thanks for watching.